The Quake franchise is one that has been stuck in not only an identity crisis since the release of the second game, but has also been a dormant and bygone series, the same series that had brought FPS multiplayer into the stratosphere in the 90s, giving life to other multiplayer experiences like Unreal Tournament, Counter-Strike, and even Halo Combat Evolved. It was the king of the arena shooter genre, with Quake 3 Arena cementing that fact at the time. But then later on, id Software made a big push for the id Tech 4 engine, their latest product that would power future titles around that time. And the first game that would be born from that engine was Doom 3, the long-awaited sequel amongst the Doom community that polarized them, dividing the player base into two camps. One hating it for how slow and methodical it felt, and the other camp where fans like me embraced it, enjoying the different but horror-focused experience of Doom. Critically, it did really well, and in 2005 came time for the Xbox 360 to kickstart the HD generation of gaming. With id Software wanting to get in early, they brought Raven Software into the fold, and together developed a sequel for Quake, which would be Quake 4, being made for the PC and the Xbox 360. And was the reception of the game the same as Doom 3? In some ways yes, but also no. It adopted the same slower-paced gameplay of Doom 3, and coated it with new paint, set in the same universe as Quake 2 due to this one being a direct sequel to that game. Reviews were lower than Doom 3 but still somewhat favourable across the board. Fans again were disappointed that it didn't stick to its fast-paced roots of the previous title, and not only that, but the game would also be centered around team-based gameplay, something that has never happened before in any of the previous single-player modes of the Quake titles. But for me, Quake 4 was something I felt to be underappreciated and mostly forgotten about, even by a portion of its own community that pretend that the game doesn't exist. I, for one, vouch for this game. It's a solid sci-fi shooter, with some impressive visuals, great art direction in the environments and the designs of the Strogg race, and how their technology is showered throughout each level. Let's dive into it further. The opening of the game starts off in the vastness of space, with a marine floating about, turning around to reveal a mangled and mutilated corpse. We see ships arrive in a familiar planet to those who had played Quake 2. Once again, we're invading the planet of the Strogg faction, a conglomerate of cybernetic beings who invade other species and harvest their biomatter in order to survive. They invade Earth, and humanity responds with a large-scale invasion, getting right into the heart of their network, which is where you and your fellow Marines come in. You play as Matthew Kane, a supposed badass who happens to be a part of this whole shit show. You go to bed with Rhino Squad, one of many squads that you'll meet throughout the game. You crash land right into the battle zone and start linking up with other soldiers, and not too long after you start fighting Strogg infantry, all of which have a variety of unique designs of their own abilities and weapons. The soldiers you meet aren't exactly memorable, and there are a lot of them with similar faces save for the Rhino Squad members, but they nail the soldier mentality pretty well here, sort of like something you would see in Starship Troopers. The main Rhino soldiers have their own distinct personalities and traits that complement one another, and their efforts help pave the way to achieve your goals and objectives from beginning to end. You have regular grunts that make notes of their own tech, and contrasted to the Strogg tech, the medics and tech soldiers and personnel get more in-depth, talking about the specifics of the technology of the Strogg. It doesn't make any difference for us, but it does add background context and expands on the background lore and universe of this version of Quake. And when you go through the levels of Quake 4, there's a surprising amount of body horror that you'll see, from botched surgeries of human beings being studied by the Strogg, to human bodies being integrated in horrific matters within the Strogg's infrastructure and terminals. Quake 2 did the same thing, but the graphics of Quake 4 bring the debauchery of the Strogg to life, and it's one of my favourite things about this game. When you're on the Hannibal ship, you can also see the staff interacting and getting immersed in their own activities. They act as if it's another day in the office. I like it when games do this, to bring in not just NPCs, but NPCs that act like people, taking a break in the mess hall, or fixing a part on the ship, doing diagnostics in their own vehicles. It all adds to the immersion here. And the sequence of conversations and their behaviour do show what's at stake for humanity if they fail to bring the war to an end. The gunplay is pretty slow, but it's also pretty fun at times, when you're slamming Strogg with the shotgun, gibbing them with the railgun, or creating the equivalent of a black hole with the dark matter gun, which is this game's version of the BFG. Every weapon you come across have their own uses and utilities, and those utilities are extended by the upgrades that you can obtain from soldiers at different points in the game. Health and armor is generally in good supply, so you'll never be in a position where you're starving for ammo. The weapon selection is quite nice, with some guns from previous games even making a return, like the Hyper Blaster and the Railgun, the blaster with infinite ammo, the nail gun, and the lightning gun from Quake 3 Arena. The game even throws in some vehicle sections too. You get to drive a tank and a mech at different stages. They feel pretty good to use, hosting 2 different weapons, but their experiences are short-lived and feel more like a commercial break. To be honest, I didn't really feel like the game needed to have vehicles personally. The time that they took to implement them could have been put aside in favor to flesh out the game's story and gameplay more overall, since the meat and potatoes have always been on foot for the Quake franchise. Eventually, there's a turning point in the game's narrative. Your efforts to shut down the Strogg communications network gets disrupted by the Macron, the final boss from the second Quake, which leads you to getting captured, and also to the most infamous scene in the entire game. You get to watch your character get surgically mutilated in a brutal fashion, and you get to see every bit of it. Luckily, before your transformation can be complete, your squad saves you, and you're now a Stroggified version of Kane, with more health and armor, and faster movement. And you also get to use those disgusting health stations that you couldn't use earlier when you were 100% human. The speed aspect is something that should have been there in the beginning, however. I don't know why they didn't bother with having at least a sprint mechanic like they did in Doom 3, but I digress. There is one thing I did like, however, and it was what happens when you return to the Hannibal. Almost everyone on board does a 180 here, reacting to your presence and the fact that you now look like a Strogg. You get death threats, you get treated like a scientific opportunity among the medic and tech staff. It's good that they don't just ignore your changes and pretend that you're still the person you used to be. This only proves that the NPCs have an immersive design around them. They change due to your circumstances and your actions. Though not memorable, but still pretty immersive for a 2005 sci-fi shooter. The same soldiers do accompany you anyway during the game, with medic and tech soldiers replenishing your health and armor as long as they're still alive, and you're still killing the Strogg in whatever way you see fit. You do have a few boss fights, however, often with shields and health, and while it's nothing too challenging, they can still punish you if you haven't figured out their Achilles heel. Speaking of challenge, the different difficulties also determine the amount of challenge you may get from this game, which are named after military ranks for some reason. In any case, the highest difficulty usually just means that you take more damage and enemies are harder to put down as a result. But if you're a long-time FPS player, you shouldn't have too much of an issue here, especially if you come from either a Doom or a Quake background. The levels feel pretty much the same. It's a mishmash of alien industrial complexes with well-animated machinery and pretty lights. This was something id Software went hard on, because they wanted to make the best looking game possible at the time. And to be honest, it still looks pretty impressive at times. Certain scenes like this can be pretty breathtaking, showing that the id Tech 4 was capable of doing some pretty amazing shit. Of course though, it's starting to age quite a bit, and if you were to play it on the lower resolutions, or just on the 360, the game would look significantly worse. I'll provide a link in the description for PC players that will help them configure the game to your liking, since Raven and id Software basically abandoned Quake 4 not too long after its release, so you might have a bit of trouble running it on modern machines. Blood and gore is something that you'll see quite often here too, and the wonky physics from Doom 3, but it's not as ridiculous as something like Fear, where there were bathtub levels of blood, but it's still pretty impressive. Sound-wise, it does the job. I don't really have anything to say on its score since it's pretty forgettable. The sounds of the weapons, the explosions, the general ambience and the noise have the most attention here, since it's consistently a factor throughout each level. If you've come off of Doom 3, this game is going to feel pretty similar. You have the same bullshit flashlight implementation from the BFG edition where it's attached to one of your weapons, but if you use another weapon and need light, too bad, you need to go back to either the pistol or the machine gun. The levels also tend to be pretty dark, with lights flickering, enemies popping out of nowhere, even a few jump scares here and there, so again, they used Doom 3 as a blueprint to reimagine Quake, which turned out to be this. Movement is very slow, like Doom 3, but it's worse here, because you can't sprint, and Kane feels like he's not in a hurry whatsoever to get to his objectives. From level to level, you interact with buttons, you check your objectives, you link up with fellow Marines with their own lines of dialogue, and you exit in the same manner as Doom 3. So if you are not a fan of Doom 3, then chances are you will not like this game either, because both games are very similar to each other at the end of the day. So after you beat the game, what are you left with? Well, you have the multiplayer, an experience that was quickly abandoned and forgotten about not too long after by Raven and id Software. Nowadays, you have a small but dedicated player base that do still play this game, sort of like with the other Quakes. It offered a large number of maps, movement speed was faster but not by much. On the surface, it played like Quake 2's multiplayer, but again, it didn't last for long, and shortly after, a lot of people moved on to other multiplayer experiences later on like Call of Duty 4 and Halo 3. I haven't really touched upon the multiplayer myself, and I don't really have much of an interest in doing so, but I'm sure you can find a small group of those online that keep it alive. There are some that even still play Quake 2's multiplayer, as well as Doom 3. But honestly, I don't think you're missing out on anything though anyway. If you want a more dedicated multiplayer experience in the Quake franchise, then I would recommend either the first game, Quake Live, or Quake Champions. Quake 4 was, in my opinion, an underrated gem, with a lot of flaws, with a direction that only further cemented and distorted the identity of the series, with a lot of it being a result of wanting to showcase its graphics. Quake 4 comes with a pretty solid campaign that's fairly lengthy, with a nice arsenal of weapons that are reimagined, great environmental designs, and decent enemy variety. The only shame is that it never got another sequel, and the ending still gets unanswered to this very day, with Kane still awaiting orders for his next mission. With the way the franchise is going now, it's pretty unclear. Quake Champions still gets updates here and there, but it's not getting any bigger whatsoever. All the previous entries have their multiplayer on life support, with only dedicated communities supporting them, and given the monumental success of the recent Doom entries, it just shows that Quake desperately needs the same treatment, since that would be its only chance to make a comeback. Of course, with Doom Eternal being done and dusted, a new project has been confirmed, but we don't know exactly yet. I just only hope that it is a new Quake. But anyway, I still recommend that you give Quake 4 a chance. It's definitely worth playing. Thank you for watching.
But sir, Kane just got back.
Hey, what do you say we go for
Yes, sir. Don't see to
That all right with you, Kane?
it. Kane, you have new orders.